So the other thing to think about is how we went out kind of to the rest of the world, right? And this is a sample now. We're starting to get into the federal side of things because the federal government kind of represented all the states. And you do have to remember, the states kind of considered themselves sovereign. They were like a country unto themselves. They just bound together as a nation in order to protect the rights of all of the states. Okay? But when we went out to do a treaty with another country, we were going to do it based on at a national level. So this is one of the early treaties. And you can see in here what it says. America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Now, they did this to placate the Muslims on the most part because they were trying to form a treaty with Muslims, and they didn't want them thinking that we were Christian and you're Muslim and we're going to fight you, right? In this treaty was referenced later, 1900, it was actually 1899 during the McKinley administration, for the same thing in the Philippines, where the McKinley administration went to the Philippines and said, we're not a Christian nation, we can prove it. Here's the treaty that says that we're not a Christian nation, and we will never do anything to battle between Christians and Muslims. Clearly he didn't hear about Bush. Because it actually says, you can look down at the bottom here, it says religious opinions shall let's see. It is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. I think it's done that now. So, the other thing, going back to the Virginia, so I mentioned Virginia, who said they were actually a Christian state, right? You look at their Constitution, it was written in 79, became law in 86, and this is where we get the separation of church and state phrase, right? So Jefferson wrote this. He considered it one of his greatest accomplishments, and the picture up there is actually his gravestone, and one of the three things he had put on there was this accomplishment. He considered it that important. He took an incredible amount of flack for this Constitution. People really did not like that it was so secular. It pretty much outlawed any religious person taking office. There were a number of states that took on that after this Constitution came, or after this state Constitution came out. So he took a lot of flack for this, and yet he considered it one of his greatest accomplishments. So now the Declaration of Independence. So we're getting into what's called the organic documents. There are four of them, although I don't remember the middle two. The first one is the Declaration of Independence. The fourth one is the Constitution, that are considered kind of the organic documents that founded the country. The Declaration of Independence actually does reference divinity in some form. And I only put kind of one of the contexts here because it would take forever to go into the details of all of them. These are the four words or phrases that are actually used in the Declaration of Independence that have some reference to a divinity. But if you look at it in context, it actually puts nature's God after the laws of nature. Clearly, they're not referencing any specific God. They're certainly not referencing Christianity. And they never do reference Jesus Christ or Christianity or any form of it, or a Trinity, anything that you could specifically call Christian, even in the Declaration of Independence, though they do reference some form of divinity. But I like the fact that they put laws of nature ahead of nature's God. And then you look at what is nature's God. Today we might call that evolution. Not actually something divine. They probably meant it as something divine back then. Clearly they were putting this in to placate certain of the people that were going to sign it, because they were doing this in a rush, as the war was starting, they wanted to declare their independence. Then the question becomes, how relevant is this to the laws? Is the Constitution, the thing that applies? Is the Declaration of Independence? You have to look at all of those, and we will. So look at the Constitution. That document is clearly secular. There's only one reference in the entire thing to religion, and then none to a divinity or God. And the one that is a reference to religion says, no religious test shall ever be given for qualification in office. That's the only thing it references religion at all. So it's a negative statement. It doesn't reference that religion is good or bad, or that gods exist, anything like that. It's a completely secular document. And despite what some people would say now, the oath of office did not reference God at the end of it. Okay? Let's see. So, and as we were mentioning before, the Establishment Clause. So some of the stuff you actually talked about, I'll go into a little bit. The First Amendment includes what's called the Establishment Clause, and there shouldn't have been a period there because it continues on. But it says that the Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. We've heard that a lot. The question is, what does it mean? And it's under a lot of debate. And it's not real clear what this means. What does it mean to respect a religion? So let's look into it a little bit. There is certainly debate about the meaning, especially if you bring in what does it mean to the non-religious. Right? So you can look at it, it can't respect any particular religion, but that doesn't say it has to respect non-religion or atheism or anything about it. So the first thing they turn to is one of Thomas Jefferson's early letters to the Danbury Baptists. Okay, and he mentions the separation of church and state in this letter. And he says that that's what it was intending to do. So he makes it fairly clear in a letter. Now, this isn't an official document, but when the official document is pretty vague and debatable, you have to rely on what were their intentions, and that's what the Supreme Court's job is to look at all of the documents and say what were the intentions of the Constitution and of the founders. And this is one of the early letters that they relied on. He also says that religion is something solely between the person and the God, and government should have nothing to do with it. The other thing about this, and this last statement is pretty profound, or the doctrine is pretty profound, and it's not something that everybody's very aware of. So this stance about the Establishment Clause and all that really wasn't an issue for the states or the federal government for about 100 years. And this doctrine is what changed that. So up until this doctrine, the states were kind of like sovereign countries, as I said, and the federal government really didn't have say over the state. So if the federal government had a law and the state had a law, within that state, the state's law ruled. It wasn't until this incorporation doctrine that the federal government took precedence over the state. And if you think about the timing in this, you're talking about Civil War timing. So now you're looking at where states are trying to secede from the Union, and they're having all kinds of problems with the philosophies and the ideas within a state. They needed to do something. And so this incorporation doctrine basically came out from the federal government saying the federal government has precedent over the state. And that changed everything. Because if the states were religious before and the federal government wasn't, and now that the federal government has precedence, all of a sudden the nation has become non-religious by definition, even though individual states might have been. Huge change. And you'll see that none of the legal cases that I'll talk about later came about until after this doctrine. Because why bother? If you're a state, you can define your own rule to be prejudiced against atheists or whoever you want, and the federal government can't do anything about it. So after this, they could. And that's when the court cases started coming about. So I'm going to get into some legal cases now, which can be a little bit dry. So pay attention, because afterwards I'm going to ask some questions, and I have a few little rewards. So hopefully that'll keep you a little bit more awake. And you got to remember the subtle differences in some of these cases. I mean, it will look sometimes like one time the Supreme Court's deciding this, and the next time they're reversing it, and then they're reversing it again. And it's not really necessarily that they're reversing it. There are some very subtle differences in the case that they're looking at and why they decide a different route. And they have to play a very careful game, right? They can't go so far as to piss off the country completely and have changes in, the amendment to the Constitution or whatever that will castrate them. They really can't. So they have to play a little bit of a game of trying to interpret the Constitution the best way they can and not completely alienate the rest of the country, or things would change.